Eliot stumbled, his paw catching on an exposed root as Cade lunged for him. The beta pup's teeth snapped dangerously close to Eliot's ear, forcing the smaller wolf to roll out of reach. Pathetic, Cade spat, his lip curling. No wonder no one wants you in the hunt. You'd scare the prey away just by existing. Eliot's chest heaved as he struggled to his feet, his golden fur dusted with dirt. I didn't do anything to you, he said, his voice trembling. You didn't need to, Cade shot back, circling him like a predator. You're weak? Weak wolves don't belong in this pack. The other beta pups barked in agreement, their taunts echoing through the clearing. Eliot's ears flattened against his skull, and he instinctively lowered himself, trying to make himself smaller. Enough. The single word was sharp and commanding, cutting through the jeers like a knife. All heads turned as Ronan strode into the clearing, his golden eyes locked on the scene before him. Eliot felt his stomach twist. Of course, Ronan would see him like this, on the ground, dirty and humiliated. Cade hesitated, his bravado faltering under Ronan's glare. We were just... Shut up, Ronan growled, his voice low and lethal. He stepped between Cade and Eliot, his presence alone forcing the other pups to back away. You don't touch what's mine. Eliot's heart stopped. What's mine? The word sent a rush of warmth through him, but they were quickly overshadowed by doubt. Did Ronan mean it? Or was he just posturing as an alpha-to-be, protecting a weaker member of the pack out of obligation? Cade's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing, his tail tucking as he slunk away. The other pups followed? Obligation? Eliot's heart fluttered and sank all at once, his emotions tangled in the shadow of Ronan's imposing figure. Cade's lips curled back in a snarl, but even he wasn't foolish enough to challenge Ronan. Fine, he muttered, his voice dripping with disdain. But don't think this makes him worth anything. He shot Eliot one last glare before stalking off into the woods, the other beaters trailing after him. Silence blanketed the clearing once they were gone, broken only by the soft rustling of leaves. Eliot shifted uncomfortably, keeping his gaze fixed on the ground. You should have fought back, Ronan said, his voice hard but not unkind. Eliot's ears twitched, and he glanced up, startled. I couldn't. They are bigger than me. They are bullies, Ronan replied, his eyes narrowing. Size doesn't matter when you have a reason to fight. Eliot winced at the words, shame curling in his chest like smoke. I don't have a reason, he muttered, his voice barely audible. For a moment, Ronan said nothing. Then, he stepped closer, his shadow falling over Eliot. That's not true. Eliot looked up, his amber eyes meeting Ronan's golden ones. There was something fierce in Ronan's gaze, something Eliot couldn't quite understand. You're part of this pack, Ronan continued, his voice firm. And as long as I'm here, no one will hurt you. Got it? Eliot blinked, stunned. The words were a lifeline, pulling him out of the depths of his humiliation. I got it, he whispered. Ronan's expression softened for a fraction of a second before he stepped back. Good, he said, his tone lighter now. Next time, don't just stand there. Fight back. Eliot nodded quickly, though doubt still churned in his stomach. Fighting back didn't feel like something he could do, not yet. Ronan turned and began to walk away, his tail held high. But before he disappeared into the trees, he glanced over his shoulder. And stop letting them get under your skin. You're better than that, Eliot. Eliot watched him go, the warmth of his words lingering like the sun breaking through storm clouds. For a brief moment, he let himself believe that Ronan meant it, that he truly cared. But as the golden-eyed alpha disappeared into the forest, Eliot couldn't shake the feeling that one day, those words would ring hollow. Eliot sat by the river, his reflection rippling in the water as the afternoon sun dappled the surface. His fur still bore faint smudges of dirt from his earlier encounter with Cade and the others, though he had tried to wash it off. No matter how much he scrubbed, the feeling of humiliation clung to him like a second skin. Ronan's words echoed in his mind. You're better than that, Eliot. Were those words meant to encourage him or simply to soothe his pride as the future alpha? Did Ronan truly see him as anything more than a responsibility? Eliot sighed, curling his tail around himself. The faint rustle of leaves made his ears perk up. Turning his head, he caught sight of a familiar silhouette emerging from the trees. Ronan. Of course, it was him. Eliot's heart gave its usual little jump, but he quickly looked away, pretending to be engrossed in the water. "You've been out here all afternoon," Ronan said, his deep voice breaking the quiet. Eliot didn't answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the river. "Just needed some air," he finally murmured. Ronan stepped closer, his shadow falling over Eliot again. "You're still upset about what happened?" "It's nothing," Eliot said quickly, his voice tight. Ronan frowned, sitting beside him. His golden fur seemed to catch the sunlight, making him look every bit the alpha he was destined to be. "It's not nothing," he said. "Cade was out of line, and I told him so." Eliot huffed a bitter laugh. "Yeah, you told him off. And tomorrow, he'll find another reason to remind me that I'm just an Omega." Ronan's jaw tightened. "You're more than that." "Am I?" Eliot snapped, surprising even himself. He turned to face Ronan, anger and frustration bubbling to the surface. "Because it doesn't feel like it? Everyone sees me as weak, and no matter how much you tell them to stop, it doesn't change anything." Ronan stared at him, his expression unreadable. Eliot felt a pang of regret for raising his voice, but he couldn't take the words back. Finally, Ronan spoke, his voice quieter than before. "You don't get it, do you? Being an alpha doesn't mean I can fix everything. I can't control how others think. But I can protect you from them." Eliot blinked, his anger deflating slightly. "Protect me," he repeated, his tone laced with disbelief. "What happens when you're not there, Ronan? When you're too busy leading the pack to notice what happens to me?" Ronan looked away, his shoulders stiff. "That won't happen," he said firmly. "I won't let it." Eliot laughed again, this time softer, almost bitter. "You say that now. But one day, you'll have bigger things to worry about. A pack to lead. A mate to take." The words hung heavily in the air between them. Ronan's eyes flicked back to Eliot, something dark and conflicted flashing through them. But before he could respond, a distant howl echoed through the forest, a summons from the Alpha. Ronan stood abruptly, his body tense. "I have to go," he said, his tone clipped. Eliot nodded, forcing himself to look away. "Of course. The future Alpha always has somewhere to be." Ronan hesitated, as if he wanted to say more, but another howl cut through the silence, more urgent this time. With a final glance at Eliot, he turned and disappeared into the trees. Eliot watched him go, a familiar ache settling in his chest. He wanted to believe Ronan's promises, but deep down, he knew they were built on a foundation that could crumble the moment reality set in. The river's surface rippled again, and Eliot's reflection blurred, just like the future he once thought he could see so clearly. The Alpha's den loomed large at the heart of the pack's territory, its entrance framed by ancient stones that bore the scars of countless generations. Inside, the pack elders sat in a semicircle, their eyes sharp and piercing as Ronan entered. His father, Alpha Marcus, stood at the center, his presence as commanding as the mountains themselves. "You're late," Marcus growled, though his tone lacked true anger. "I was dealing with a situation," Ronan replied, his voice steady. Marcus raised an eyebrow, but he didn't press further. "Good. As a future Alpha, you'll be dealing with far more than just situations. You need to learn to act swiftly and decisively." Ronan dipped his head in acknowledgement, though his jaw tightened. He could still see Eliot's hurt expression in his mind, the bitterness in his voice cutting deeper than any wound. "Let's move on," Marcus said, his golden eyes sweeping over the gathered wolves. "The rogue sightings near the eastern border have increased. We can't afford to be complacent. Ronan, you'll lead the patrol tomorrow." Ronan straightened, the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. "Yes, father." The elders exchanged approving nods, their trust in Ronan's capabilities clear. But as the meeting continued, his thoughts drifted back to Eliot. Eliot, meanwhile, lingered on the outskirts of the territory, far from the noise of the pack. The forest was quiet here, the towering trees offering a sense of solace he couldn't find among his own kind. He crouched by a patch of wildflowers, his fingers brushing against their delicate petals. His mind replayed the words he had thrown at Ronan earlier, a mix of regret and frustration gnawing at him. "You're more than that," Ronan had said. But was he? A sudden snap of a twig jolted Eliot out of his thoughts. His ears perked, and he quickly rose to his feet, scanning the shadows. "Who's there?" he called, his voice trembling slightly. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, a figure emerged from the trees, a wolf he didn't recognize. The stranger's fur was a silvery gray, his eyes sharp and assessing. "Didn't mean to startle you," the wolf said, his voice smooth. "I was just passing through." Eliot's instinct screamed at him to run, but something about the stranger's calm demeanor rooted him in place. "You're not from this pack," he said cautiously. The wolf chuckled, his lips curling into a sly smile. "No, I'm not. But I couldn't help noticing how isolated you seem." Eliot stiffened, his heart racing. "I'm not isolated," he said defensively. The stranger tilted his head, his gaze uncomfortably knowing. "Aren't you? An Omega like you, left to fend for yourself. That's not how packs are supposed to work, is it?" Eliot's breath hitched. The stranger's words struck too close to home. "Who are you?" Eliot demanded, taking a step back. The wolf's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Call me Silas. And don't worry, little Omega, I'm not here to cause trouble. At least, not for you." Before Eliot could respond, Silas turned and disappeared into the trees, leaving behind only the faintest trace of his scent. Eliot stood frozen, his mind racing. Whoever Silas was, he didn't belong here, and his presence could only mean trouble. Back at the den, Ronan felt a prickle of unease, though he couldn't explain why. As the meeting adjourned, he stepped outside, his eyes scanning the horizon. Something didn't feel right. His thoughts turned once again to Eliot. He had promised to protect him, but could he truly keep that promise in a world filled with dangers he couldn't foresee? Ronan's claws dug into the earth. No matter what, he wouldn't let anything happen to Eliot. Even if it meant defying the very traditions that bound them both. The next morning, Eliot woke to the sound of bickering outside his den. Groaning, he buried his face in the mossy bedding, hoping it would stop. "Do you even know how to track? Or do you just stomp around, scaring everything within 10 miles? "Oh, I'm sorry, Cade," came Ronan's sarcastic reply. "I didn't realize your stealth technique involved whining so loudly that even the squirrels are mocking you." Eliot peeked out of his den to see Ronan and Cade nose to nose, their tails flicking with irritation. Several other wolves in the patrol looked on, barely hiding their amusement. "Maybe I wouldn't have to whine if our future alpha wasn't such a know-it-all," Cade shot back, puffing out his chest like a rooster. "Know-it-all? I'm sorry, remind me, how many times have you gotten us lost on patrol?" Ronan smirked, his tone sharp enough to cut through stone. "Once," Cade muttered. "Twice," another wolf chimed in. "3 times," said another. Cade glared at them. "Whose side are you on?" Eliot couldn't help but snicker softly, the sound surprising even himself. He quickly ducked back into his den, hoping no one had noticed. Later that day, Eliot found himself assigned to gather herbs near the southern border. He worked quietly, grateful for the solitude. But as he reached for a particularly stubborn root, he heard the telltale crunch of paws behind him. "Stalking me again, Ronan?" Eliot teased without looking up, surprising himself with his boldness. "Not stalking," Ronan replied, leaning casually against a tree. "Supervising." Eliot straightened, raising an eyebrow. "You're the future alpha. Don't you have better things to do than supervise an Omega pulling weeds?" Ronan shrugged, the corner of his mouth twitching upward. "Maybe. Or maybe I just wanted to make sure you didn't get tangled in the weeds and need rescuing again." Eliot shot him a glare, though he couldn't stop the small smile that tugged at his lips. "I'm perfectly capable of handling myself, thanks." "Sure you are," Ronan said with a grin. "That's why I heard you arguing with a root for 5 minutes. Eliot's cheeks burned. It was stuck. It was winning, Ronan quipped, his golden eyes sparkling with mischief. Why are you really here? Eliot asked, crossing his arms. Ronan hesitated, his teasing demeanor faltering. I just wanted to check on you. After yesterday. Eliot's smile faded, and he looked away. I'm fine. Are you? Ronan asked softly, stepping closer. Because it didn't sound like it yesterday when you said I wouldn't be there for you. Eliot stiffened, his gaze fixed on the ground. I didn't mean to say that, he mumbled. Not like that, anyway. Ronan sat down beside him, the playful air replaced with something more serious. You weren't wrong, he admitted. One day, I'll have more responsibilities than I can count. But that doesn't mean I'll stop caring about you, Eliot. Eliot glanced at him, his chest tightening. Why do you care so much? Ronan hesitated, as if weighing his next words carefully. Because you're part of this pack. And because I don't like seeing you hurt. Before Eliot could respond, a squirrel suddenly darted out of the bushes, chittering furiously at Ronan as if scolding him for existing. Ronan blinked, startled. What's your problem? Eliot snorted, unable to stop himself. Looks like even the squirrels think you're too much. Ronan shot him a mock glare but couldn't hide his smile. Watch it, Omega, or I'll have to add you to my list of annoyances. Oh, I'm honored to make the cut, Eliot replied, his smile lingering even as he turned back to his herbs. For the first time in a long while, the tension between them felt lighter, like maybe, just maybe, they could exist in the same world without everything falling apart. Eliot carried his small bundle of herbs back to the healer's den, the lingering warmth of his earlier conversation with Ronan still tugging at the edges of his mind. For a brief moment, it felt like everything was normal. But normalcy, Eliot knew, was a fragile thing in the pack. The den smelled of earth and sage as he stepped inside, where the elderly healer, Greta, was sorting through dried roots. She glanced up at him, her sharp green eyes narrowing slightly. You're late. Eliot blinked. What? You didn't even tell me when to be here. Greta raised a bushy eyebrow, unimpressed. A good Omega knows when he's needed without being told. Right, Eliot muttered, setting the herbs down on the flat stone in the center of the den. I'll just add mind reading to my skill set. Greta let out a snort. Don't bother. You'd be terrible at it. Eliot rolled his eyes but couldn't help the small grin that tugged at his lips. Greta's sharp tongue was oddly comforting, like being swatted by a grumpy, overprotective mother bear. As he began sorting the herbs, the den grew quiet, save for the soft rustle of leaves and the distant chatter of the pack outside. Eliot's thoughts drifted back to the rogue wolf, Silas, who had appeared so suddenly the day before. His smooth words and unsettling smile had been haunting Eliot ever since. Greta, Eliot began hesitantly, have you ever met a rogue named Silas? The old healer froze mid-motion, her fingers hovering over a bundle of lavender. Her eyes darted to Eliot, and for a moment, her usual sharpness was replaced with something colder. Where did you hear that name? Eliot swallowed hard. He showed up near the southern border yesterday. He didn't do anything, just talked. But something about him felt wrong. Greta's expression darkened. Rogues are always trouble, but Silas? He's worse. Charming as a fox and twice as dangerous. Stay away from him, Eliot. He's not the kind of wolf you want sniffing around you. Eliot shivered at the warning in her voice. Why would he even come here? Greta shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin line. I don't know, but it can't be good. Tell Ronan or Alpha Marcus if you see him again. And for the moon's sake, don't go wandering alone. Eliot nodded quickly, her words sinking in. The weight of the rogue's presence settled heavily on his chest, but there was something else, too, an inexplicable curiosity. Meanwhile, Ronan was leading the patrol near the eastern border, his golden eyes scanning the dense forest. The other wolves followed closely behind, their movements synchronized and precise. Smell anything? Ronan asked, his voice low. Just the usual, deer, Rabbits, and your overwhelming ego, Cade muttered under his breath. Ronan shot him a glare. Careful, Cade. If my ego gets any bigger, it might decide to sit on you. One of the other beaters snickered, earning a scowl from Cade. Focus, Ronan growled, his tone turning serious. Rogues don't announce themselves. If Silas is anywhere near our territory, we need to find him before he causes trouble. The group fell silent as they moved deeper into the woods, their senses on high alert. But even as Ronan led the patrol, his mind kept drifting back to Eliot. The thought of Silas being anywhere near him made Ronan's blood boil. When they reached a small clearing, one of the wolves froze, sniffing the air. Over here, he whispered, motioning for the others to follow. Ronan approached cautiously, his fur bristling. The scent was faint but unmistakable, a rogue scent. And it was recent. Spread out, he ordered. Find him. As the wolves fanned out, Ronan's heart pounded in his chest. If Silas had come anywhere near Eliot again, Ronan would make sure the rogue regretted ever stepping paw into their territory. Back at the pack's main grounds, Eliot tried to push the rogue from his mind as he helped Greta organize supplies. But when the sun dipped lower in the sky and shadows began creeping into the den, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching him. Stop daydreaming, Greta snapped, startling him. Eliot forced a laugh. Right. Sorry. But as he stepped outside into the cool evening air, his laughter died in his throat. A pair of silver eyes gleamed at him from the edge of the forest, just for a moment, before disappearing into the shadows. Silas. Eliot's heart raced, and he turned back toward the den, his paws moving faster than he thought possible. Eliot's breath quickened as he spun on his heels, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The shadows at the edge of the clearing seemed to stretch longer, darker, almost as if they were moving. He could still feel Silas's gaze on him, piercing and cold. He didn't waste another second, darting back toward the den, his paws pounding the earth in a panic. The safety of the pack felt too far away, the woods too vast and silent around him. His mind raced, each beat of his heart thumping against his ribs like a warning drum. As he neared the den, he collided with someone, hard. Watch it, Omega! Cade's voice barked, but his tone softened as he saw who it was. Eliot's golden fur was ruffled, eyes wide with fear. What's wrong with you? You look like you've seen a ghost. Eliot couldn't catch his breath long enough to explain. I saw him, he gasped. Silas. He was watching me, right there. He pointed toward the trees, his body still shaking. Cade frowned, his posture stiffening. Silas? That rogue's been causing trouble for a while. Why is he near the pack? I don't know. Eliot replied, his panic rising again. He was just standing there, watching me like I was some sort of prey. Cade opened his mouth, probably to say something more, but a low growl interrupted him. Stay away from him, Cade. Ronan's voice was a deep, authoritative rumble, and both Cade and Eliot turned to see him striding toward them. His golden eyes locked on Eliot, brows furrowed with concern. Eliot, are you okay? The fear that had knotted in Eliot's chest loosened a little at the sight of Ronan. Despite his authority, despite the alpha-in-training aura around him, Ronan's eyes softened in a way that made Eliot's heart skip. I saw him again. Silas, Eliot repeated, his voice trembling. He was standing in the woods, watching me. Just like yesterday. Ronan's expression darkened. Where exactly? Eliot pointed shakily toward the trees. Over there. I don't know if he's still there, but... Stay here, Ronan commanded, his voice suddenly colder, more commanding than Eliot had ever heard it. Cade, with me. Cade gave a short nod, but his mouth twisted into an unsatisfied grimace. You think he's still out there? Ronan's eyes narrowed. He's close. I can feel it. Without waiting for further protest, Ronan turned and led the way back toward the woods, his steps silent and predatory. Eliot watched them disappear into the shadows, the unsettling stillness of the forest swallowing them whole. The pack members who had gathered nearby exchanged concerned glances but remained quiet, knowing better than to question Ronan's orders. The silence felt heavy. As Ronan and Cade moved deeper into the woods, the tension between them was palpable. Cade's usual brashness was subdued, but his frustration was clear. Why is it always you, huh? Why is it always the future alpha who gets to deal with everything? Ronan ignored him at first, his senses on high alert. The rogue scent was faint, but it was there, like the crisp tang of autumn leaves mixed with something darker, something predatory. I'm not doing this for fun, Cade, Ronan muttered, his eyes scanning the trees. We need to find him before he gets any closer to the pack. I didn't mean it like that, Cade said, his tone shifting. But come on, man. You can't tell me you're not thinking about Eliot. That pup's always under your skin. Ronan stopped abruptly, his heart pounding. What are you talking about? Cade smirked, his eyes glinting with teasing mischief. Don't play coy. You've been hovering around him more than usual. The way you look at him, it's obvious to everyone. Ronan's jaw clenched, his pulse quickening. Stay focused. Right. But hey, don't blame me if I see things that are plain as day. Cade shrugged, his grin still in place. Ronan wasn't sure if he wanted to punch Cade or strangle him. He felt the tug of something strange deep inside him, something that made him wonder if Cade was right. Was it really that obvious? Was he really that obvious? A rustle of leaves caught his attention, and he held up a hand to stop Cade from speaking further. The rogue scent was stronger now, thick with menace. Stay low, Ronan whispered, his body instinctively crouching as he motioned for Cade to follow. They moved through the underbrush silently, closer to the source of the scent. Through a break in the trees, they saw him, Silas. The rogue's silver fur blended with the moonlight, giving him an almost ethereal quality. He stood, relaxed but watchful, as though waiting for something, or someone. Cade's claws flexed, his body tensing with readiness, but Ronan held up a hand to stop him. Not yet, Ronan said quietly. We need to approach carefully. Silas, sensing something, turned his head slowly toward them, his piercing silver eyes locking onto Ronan's. A slow smile spread across his face. Well, Silas said, his voice smooth and honeyed. The future alpha graces me with his presence. I was wondering when you'd show up. Ronan's stance hardened, his muscles coiling with intent. This is our territory, rogue. You don't belong here. Silas's smile only widened. Oh, I belong wherever I choose to. And today, I've chosen to visit an old friend. His gaze flickered to Cade before returning to Ronan. Cade's snarl was immediate, but Ronan raised a paw, signaling for him to hold back. We're not your friends, Silas, Ronan growled. And you're leaving, now. Silas tilted his head, his smile never fading. Such a pity. I was hoping we could talk. But I suppose it's too soon to have a real conversation, isn't it? The tension between them crackled, thick as a storm on the horizon. Would this be the end of their encounter, or the beginning of something far more dangerous? The air between Ronan and Silas grew thick with unspoken tension. Silas took a step forward, his silver eyes glinting with mischief. You don't even know what I want, do you? His voice was a low, almost purring tone, so smooth it made the fur on the back of Ronan's neck stand on end. Ronan's posture remained rigid, his muscles coiled tightly like a spring ready to snap. Whatever you want, it's not welcome here. Leave now, before I make you. Cade growled under his breath, clearly itching for a fight. You sure you don't want to take him on, Ronan? I'm pretty sure this guy's not just gonna walk away. Silas laughed, a sharp, mocking sound that echoed through the clearing. Oh, I'm sure he'd love to, but that's not really how this works, is it? His gaze flickered toward the shadows of the trees, and for a brief moment Ronan thought he saw something else in Silas's eyes, something darker, more calculating. What do you want with the pack? Ronan demanded, stepping forward, his tone becoming more forceful. Silas's smile faded just enough for Ronan to catch a glimpse of something dangerous lurking beneath. I want what I've always wanted, freedom. I just thought I'd stop by to see how you've been doing. You know, checking in on the future Alpha. Making sure you haven't forgotten what's out here, lurking in the shadows." He gestured vaguely to the dark woods surrounding them. Ronan's teeth flashed in a growl. "You're not welcome here, Silas. If you wanted freedom, you'd stay far away from this territory." Silas tilted his head, his expression shifting into one of mock sympathy. "I see. So it's the pack, then. You've gotten all cozy with your little wolves, haven't you?" His eyes flicked over Ronan's shoulder, as if looking for something, or someone, specific. Ronan's gaze snapped to Cade, whose fur was bristling with restrained energy. Silas's attention was far too focused on something, or someone, else. "What's that supposed to mean?" Cade growled, stepping forward slightly. "Oh, nothing," Silas said with a shrug, though his smile returned with a knowing gleam. "I just find it interesting, that's all. The things we choose to protect." A sudden wave of unease washed over Ronan. He wasn't sure whether it was the rogue's words or the way Silas was studying him, but something about this encounter felt wrong, off balance. "I'm warning you, Silas," Ronan said, his voice hard and cold. "Leave, or I'll force you out." Silas's gaze lingered a moment longer before he turned with deliberate slowness, his silver fur flickering in the moonlight as he moved. "Don't worry, Ronan. I'll leave. For now." Ronan didn't relax until the rogue scent finally faded into the wind, but even then, the unease lingered like a shadow at the edge of his mind. Eliot sat in the den, his thoughts a jumbled mess. He had tried to push his encounter with Silas from his mind, but the rogue's gaze kept returning to him, sharp and unsettling. What did Silas want? And why had he been watching him? His thoughts were interrupted when Ronan appeared at the entrance to the den, his golden eyes scanning the room with quiet intensity. Eliot's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't deny the way his chest tightened every time Ronan looked at him like that, like there was something more between them than just pack duty. But it wasn't that simple, was it? "Ronan," Eliot began, his voice unsure. "Is everything okay?" Ronan's gaze softened slightly as he approached, his steps purposeful. "It's handled. Silas won't be coming back anytime soon." Eliot nodded, though he still felt a strange weight in his chest. "But why was he here? What does he want?" Ronan sighed, sitting down next to him. His presence was warm, comforting even, but there was still something guarded in the way he held himself. "I'm not sure, Eliot. Rogues are unpredictable, and Silas is dangerous. We'll keep watch, but for now, you're safe." Eliot opened his mouth to speak, but the words got caught in his throat. Instead, he simply nodded again, though doubt still lingered. "Hey," Ronan's voice was soft, almost too soft. "Are you all right?" The question was simple, but Eliot felt his heart beat a little faster. It wasn't often that Ronan showed this side of himself, the side that cared, that seemed to soften when it came to Eliot. I don't know." Eliot's voice trembled, and he hated how vulnerable it made him feel. "It just feels like something's wrong. Like something's watching me." Ronan's expression grew serious, his eyes scanning the clearing beyond the den. "If you need anything at all, you come to me. Understand?" Eliot hesitated before nodding slowly. "I understand." Ronan's gaze lingered a moment longer, then he stood. "I'm heading back to check the borders. Stay here. I'll keep you safe." But even as Ronan left, Eliot couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't as safe as Ronan believed. Later that night, as the moon rose high and cast its silver light across the clearing, Eliot lay awake, staring at the ceiling of the den. His thoughts were a whirlwind, of Silas, of Ronan, and the strange feelings that twisted in his chest every time their paths crossed. Why did Silas seem so intent on him? What was it about Eliot that had drawn the rogue's attention? A soft rustle outside the den made Eliot's heart skip a beat. He strained his ears, but there was nothing but the sound of the night wind stirring the leaves. Yet, in his gut, Eliot couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. Silas's presence loomed over him, even in the safety of the den. And as the hours ticked by, Eliot couldn't help but wonder, was he truly safe? Or was the rogue already closer than he thought? The moon hung high in the sky, casting a silver sheen over the pack's territory as Ronan prowled the perimeter. His senses were sharpened, every rustle of leaves or snap of twigs sending him into a heightened state of alert. He hadn't been able to shake the feeling that Silas was still lurking out there, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Cade, keeping pace by his side, occasionally shot glances in his direction, clearly sensing his alpha's agitation. "You've been on edge all night," Cade remarked, his voice a mix of concern and annoyance. "What's really going on, Ronan? This isn't just about Silas, is it?" Ronan stiffened, his golden eyes flashing. "What do you mean?" Cade huffed. "I mean you've been acting different. Especially when it comes to Eliot. You can't hide it. The whole pack can feel it. You've got some kind of thing for him, don't you?" Ronan's jaw clenched, and for a moment, he considered snapping at Cade to shut him up. But there was truth in Cade's words, and Ronan knew it. "I'm not," he bit off the words, his voice low. "It's complicated. You wouldn't understand." Cade raised an eyebrow. "Try me. You've got the whole pack whispering about you too. You've been acting like a protective little pup whenever Eliot's around. And the way you look at him," he smirked. "It's obvious." Ronan stopped in his tracks, his chest rising and falling with frustration. "I don't know what you think you're seeing, Cade, but it's not like that. He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Cade didn't push further, but his grin remained. "Sure, Ronan. Sure." With a sigh, Ronan continued his patrol, the weight of Cade's words lingering in his mind. He wasn't sure when it had started, this feeling for Eliot. But the more he thought about it, the more his own feelings confused him. They were so different, weren't they? Eliot was the soft, delicate Omega. And Ronan was the future Alpha, trained to lead, to protect, not to get distracted by someone like him. Still, every time Eliot looked at him with those golden, earnest eyes, Ronan's heart raced. The rest of the patrol was tense, each wolf on high alert. But as they neared the edge of the territory, Ronan's ears pricked up. The scent of Silas was stronger here, lingering in the air like a bad omen. "This is it," Ronan whispered to Cade, his eyes narrowing. "He's close." Cade nodded, his muscles tensing. "Let's catch him. End this." The two wolves crept closer to the boundary, their steps silent as they stalked through the underbrush. The scent of the rogue was heavy now, almost suffocating. Then, from the shadows, a voice called out, a low, mocking chuckle that sent chills down Ronan's spine. "You've come all this way for me, future Alpha?" Silas stepped into the clearing, his silver fur gleaming under the moonlight. "How flattering." Ronan growled, his hackles raised. "This is your last warning, Silas. Leave. Now." Silas chuckled again, stepping closer, his eyes flashing with an eerie, knowing gleam. "I'm not here for a fight. Not yet." Ronan stepped forward, his body coiled, ready to spring. "Then what are you here for?" "I'm here for a conversation," Silas said smoothly. "For understanding. For making you see things clearly." Cade snarled, his patience wearing thin. "Cut the crap, Silas. What do you really want?" Silas's eyes flickered toward the distant trees, his gaze thoughtful. "I want what I've always wanted, freedom. A world where I'm not bound by these rules, where I don't have to answer to anyone. Where I can live as I choose." Ronan's gaze hardened. "And you think we'll just let you roam around freely? You've been a threat for too long." "Oh, I'm not a threat," Silas said with a sly grin. "At least, not in the way you think. I'm simply an opportunity." The word sent a ripple of unease through Ronan. "An opportunity?" Silas's silver eyes locked onto him, an unreadable expression crossing his face. "An opportunity for change. You see, Ronan, you're not the only one with power. You're not the only one with a future to control. But the real question is, what are you going to do about it?" Before Ronan could respond, a rustle from behind him made his hackles stand on end. He turned sharply, his heart racing, just in time to see Eliot emerge from the shadows, his golden eyes wide and uncertain. "Eliot!" Ronan barked, his voice filled with surprise and concern. "What are you doing here?" Eliot froze at the sight of Silas, his body tense with fear. I couldn't sleep. I heard you both, and," he trailed off, his eyes shifting between the two older wolves. Silas's smile grew wider, a predatory glint in his eyes. "Ah, the young Omega. Come closer, little one. Don't be shy." Ronan's heart thudded in his chest, and he moved quickly to put himself between Eliot and the rogue. "Stay behind me," he ordered sharply. Eliot hesitated, his gaze locked on Silas, then on Ronan. The tension between them seemed to crackle in the air, thick with unspoken words. "I don't trust him, Ronan," Eliot said quietly, his voice low but resolute. "He's dangerous. I can feel it." Ronan looked back at him, his golden eyes softening with concern. "You're right," he said quietly, then turned to Silas. "Leave. Now. This is your last chance." Silas's smile faded slightly, but he didn't retreat. "You know, Ronan, you're making a mistake. I'm not your enemy, but I will be if you force me into a corner." Ronan's posture was unyielding. "This is your last warning." For a long moment, there was only the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. Finally, Silas laughed, a cruel, hollow sound. "You're not ready for what's coming, Ronan," Silas said, his eyes dark with unspoken threats. "But I'll be waiting. And when the time comes, you'll be the one who needs me." With one last glance at Eliot, Silas turned and melted into the shadows, his form disappearing into the night. Ronan let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, his body still tense from the encounter. Eliot looked up at him, his voice small. "What does he mean, Ronan? What's coming?" Ronan hesitated, the weight of Silas's words pressing down on him. He didn't have an answer. But one thing was clear, the calm they had once known was over. The shadows had moved too close, and now, they would have to face whatever Silas had started. And Ronan wasn't sure if he was ready for it. The clearing felt unusually quiet after Silas's departure, the tension in the air like a storm about to break. Ronan stood still for a moment, his senses hyper-aware, listening for any hint of movement in the shadows. But there was nothing. Only the distant howls of other wolves, their voices a reminder that the pack was still safe, for now. Eliot was close, but not too close, his golden eyes searching Ronan's face for some sign that everything was still under control. Ronan turned to him, forcing a steady breath. "You shouldn't be out here alone, Eliot." Eliot didn't reply right away, his gaze still locked on the empty space where Silas had vanished. He wasn't sure why he'd come out there. Maybe it was the fear of the unknown, or perhaps it was just the instinct to find Ronan when things felt too uncertain. Either way, the tension between them now was palpable, thickening the air between them like a heavy fog. "I heard him," Eliot said quietly. "I heard Silas. He's dangerous, Ronan. I can feel it." Ronan didn't know how to reassure him. He couldn't lie about Silas's presence, every word the rogue spoke had been a promise, a warning. But he also couldn't let fear take root in Eliot's heart, not when he needed to stay strong for both of them. "I know," Ronan said, his voice soft but firm. "But you're safe. I won't let anything happen to you." Eliot looked at him then, and for a brief moment, their gazes met, the weight of Ronan's words hanging in the space between them. But Eliot's expression was distant, as though something was nagging at him, something unsaid that he couldn't shake. "Do you mean that?" Eliot's voice was small, fragile, like he wasn't sure if he could trust the sincerity in Ronan's eyes. Ronan's heart stuttered in his chest. It was a simple question, one that should have been easy to answer, but in the quiet of the night, it felt like the most impossible thing he'd ever been asked. Of course, he meant it. But he wasn't sure how to explain what that meant, not without revealing everything he had been hiding. The weight of his own emotions felt too heavy to bear, like a burden that had grown too large to carry on his own. Ronan started, but his words trailed off. The truth was, he didn't have an answer for Eliot. Not a good one. Before he could finish, Cade's voice cut through the silence, bringing him back to reality. "Hey, you two still standing there or what? We've got work to do." Cade stepped into the clearing, his sharp gaze scanning the scene. He saw the tension between them, but said nothing, simply giving a quick nod. "We're moving out. The Alpha wants a status update on the perimeter." Ronan clenched his jaw, but nodded in return. "Right. Let's go." Eliot's shoulders slumped as he let out a quiet sigh. Ronan could feel the weight of his frustration, but he also knew that this wasn't something he could fix with words alone, not yet. The trio made their way toward the edge of the territory, the shadows of the trees now feeling even darker, heavier. But as they walked, Ronan couldn't help but steal glances at Eliot, whose silence seemed to speak volumes. He wanted to say something, to reassure him, but the words didn't come. Instead, the distance between them seemed to stretch even further, like an invisible chasm that neither of them knew how to cross. The next few days passed in a blur of uneasy patrols and forced normalcy. Silas's presence still loomed over them, a constant reminder of the rogue's threat. But more than that, there was an unspoken tension between Ronan and Eliot that neither of them seemed willing to address. Ronan had always prided himself on being in control, the alpha-to-be who could manage the pack's affairs with a steady hand. But with Eliot, everything felt different, uncertain. He had never been good at showing vulnerability, and with Eliot, it seemed even harder. That evening, after the last patrol of the day, Ronan found himself lingering at the edge of the pack's camp. The other wolves were gathered around the fire, laughing and talking, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. His eyes instinctively searched for Eliot, finding him sitting on a rock near the edge of the camp, staring at the flickering flames. Eliot had always been quieter than the other pups, but tonight, there was a loneliness in him that Ronan couldn't ignore. Without thinking, Ronan moved toward him. His feet carried him across the clearing, but as he got closer, he hesitated, unsure of how to approach. Eliot glanced up as he approached, his eyes meeting Ronan's for a fleeting moment before quickly dropping to the ground. "Eliot," Ronan said, his voice softer than he had intended. "Are you okay?" Eliot didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked back at the fire, the light from the flames dancing across his features. "I'm fine," Eliot finally said, his voice quiet, but Ronan could hear the crack in it. Ronan moved closer, his posture tense but determined. "You don't look fine. What's going on?" Eliot shifted uncomfortably, his fingers tracing patterns in the dirt. "It's nothing," he muttered, clearly avoiding eye contact. Ronan took a breath, frustration and confusion swirling in his chest. He couldn't stand seeing Eliot like this, closed off and distant. He needed to know what was going on, what had changed between them. "I don't believe that," Ronan said, his voice hardening. "You've been acting different since Silas showed up. What's really bothering you, Eliot?" Eliot's gaze flickered up to meet his, and for the briefest moment, Ronan saw something flicker in those golden eyes, hurt, confusion, and something else he couldn't quite place. "Why do you care?" Eliot asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ronan's breath caught in his throat, the question striking him like a blow. "What do you mean?" Eliot swallowed hard, his voice shaky. "Why do you care about me, Ronan? You've been acting different around me, and I don't get it. One minute you're protecting me like I'm something precious, and the next, it's like I'm invisible." Ronan froze, the weight of Eliot's words settling on his chest. He had never been good at this, at opening up or explaining himself. But Eliot needed to hear the truth, whether Ronan was ready to say it or not. "I care," Ronan said finally, his voice low and sincere. "I care because I don't want to lose you. But I don't know how to." His words trailed off, and Eliot was silent for a long moment. Then, with a deep breath, Eliot finally turned to him fully, his expression unreadable. "I don't know what to do with that, Ronan," he said quietly. Ronan swallowed, the tension between them thick and heavy. He had no answer for that, only the feeling that everything was on the verge of changing, and that he wasn't sure if he was ready for it. But as they stood there, the crackling of the fire between them, one thing was certain, the bond between them was growing, whether they were ready for it or not. The silence between Ronan and Eliot lingered long after that conversation by the fire. It wasn't the kind of silence that was comfortable, like the quiet moments spent together in the pack's territory, but the kind that weighed heavily, filled with all the unspoken things neither of them could fully articulate. The days that followed seemed to drag on, as if the universe was deliberately stretching the tension between them. Ronan threw himself into his duties as the pack's future alpha, checking the perimeter and overseeing the pack's training with a kind of urgency that bordered on obsession. He couldn't stop thinking about Silas, about the rogue's threat and what his words might mean for the pack. But underneath it all, the image of Eliot, that distant look in his golden eyes, gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing him, and every moment spent avoiding the truth only made that fact more apparent. Eliot, for his part, seemed withdrawn, his presence barely a shadow among the other wolves. He spent more time on the outskirts of camp, quietly observing the other pups with a mix of longing and detachment. The distance between him and Ronan had become palpable, like an invisible wall that neither of them knew how to tear down. That evening, the pack had gathered for a full moon feast, tradition where they came together to share food, stories, and the bonds of their pack. It was a rare moment when the alpha and his wolves could relax and enjoy the camaraderie of their family. But tonight, even the moon seemed to cast a cold light over the gathering, the shadows deep and dark despite the warmth of the fire. Ronan found himself at the edge of the clearing, his eyes scanning the pack, but there was one wolf he couldn't seem to locate. Eliot was nowhere to be found. "Cade," Ronan called, his voice sharp. "Where's Eliot?" Cade looked up from the conversation he was having with a few of the younger wolves and shrugged. "Haven't seen him. He slipped off earlier, but I figured he'd be around." Ronan's heart sank, his worry escalating as he pushed past Cade and moved swiftly through the camp. It didn't take long to find him, tucked away in the quietest corner of the territory, sitting on a fallen log with his knees drawn up to his chest. "Eliot," Ronan called softly as he approached. Eliot didn't look up, his eyes fixed on the ground, but his ears flicked toward Ronan's voice. "I just needed a moment," he muttered, though the way his voice shook betrayed a deeper strain. Ronan stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. There was a painful silence between them, one that seemed to stretch longer with each passing second. Finally, he took a step closer, his tone gentle. "Eliot, we need to talk." "I don't think I can do this anymore," Eliot said suddenly, his voice breaking. "I don't think I can keep pretending that everything is fine." Ronan's heart pounded, and he dropped down beside him, his golden eyes filled with confusion. "What do you mean?" he asked, though he had an inkling of where this might be going. Eliot's shoulders trembled as he finally looked up, meeting Ronan's gaze with a mixture of sadness and frustration. "I don't know how to be around you anymore. I don't know where I fit in, Ronan. One minute, you're protecting me, like I'm something precious, and the next, you're so distant, like I'm nothing. I don't know what I mean to you, and it's tearing me apart." Ronan opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. How could he explain it? How could he tell Eliot that he didn't know either? That every time he looked at him, his feelings were all tangled up in a mess of longing and confusion? Ronan struggled, his voice thick. "I never meant to hurt you, Eliot. I care about you, more than you know. But I'm just trying to figure things out. I don't know how to deal with these feelings. I've never felt this way about anyone before." Eliot's eyes softened, though the sadness remained. "I don't know how to deal with it either," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "But pretending like it's all okay, pretending that it's fine, it's killing me, Ronan." The words hung between them like a heavy fog, suffocating in its weight. Ronan reached out instinctively, his hand hovering just over Eliot's before he pulled it back. He didn't know how to bridge the gap between them, how to offer comfort when he felt so lost himself. But he couldn't just let Eliot slip away. "I don't have all the answers," Ronan admitted, his voice raw. "But I don't want to lose you. Whatever this is, whatever we are, I want to figure it out, together. We'll take it one step at a time." Eliot looked at him, the vulnerability in his eyes almost too much to bear. Slowly, he nodded, though it was clear that neither of them was completely convinced. "One step at a time," he echoed softly. For the first time in days, Ronan felt a small weight lift off his chest. They weren't there yet, not by a long shot, but at least they had taken a step forward. A step toward understanding, even if it was just the beginning. The rest of the night passed quietly, the full moon hanging above them as the pack celebrated with renewed energy, oblivious to the inner turmoil of their future Alpha and his Omega. Ronan and Eliot sat together for the remainder of the feast, but there was still an underlying tension, a silent promise between them that they would face whatever came next, together, even if neither of them knew what that would look like. As the night wore on and the fire died down, Ronan found himself watching Eliot, his golden eyes filled with a mix of hope and apprehension. The road ahead was uncertain, and there would be challenges, both from within the pack and from Silas, whose shadow still loomed large, but for the first time in a long while, Ronan felt like he wasn't walking it alone. Eliot was there. And for now, that was enough. The following days were a blur of tension and unspoken words. The camp seemed to hold its breath, the wolves going about their duties, but there was a quiet unease beneath it all. Ronan could feel the weight of the pack's expectations on his shoulders, but it was the weight of Eliot's emotions that consumed him. Despite the brief conversation they'd had by the fire, things between them remained fragile. Eliot had pulled back again, keeping his distance during the pack's daily activities, and Ronan could feel the strain each time their eyes met. They hadn't spoken about what had happened, hadn't discussed what they were, or what they might become. It was easier to pretend everything was fine, but Ronan knew they were only postponing the inevitable. Eliot had always been so open with his emotions, but now there was a coldness about him. He barely interacted with the pack anymore, spending most of his time in isolation, away from the laughter and camaraderie of the others. Ronan tried to approach him a few times, but each time Eliot seemed to retreat further into himself. Alpha, Cade's voice cut through Ronan's thoughts as he stood by the camp's edge, his eyes scanning the woods beyond. The Alpha wants to see you. Ronan nodded, his focus momentarily shifting away from Eliot. I'm coming. As he walked through the camp, Ronan couldn't help but steal glances at Eliot, who was once again sitting apart from the group, his eyes distant as he stared at nothing in particular. It broke Ronan's heart to see him like this, but he didn't know how to fix it, or even if he could. When Ronan reached the Alpha's den, he was greeted by the elder wolf, his weathered face a mix of concern and authority. Ronan, the Alpha said, his voice deep and steady. There's something we need to discuss. It's about Silas. Ronan nodded, his stomach tightening at the mention of the rogue. What's going on? The Alpha's expression darkened. We've been receiving reports. Silas has been gathering a small group of wolves. Rogues, mostly. I think he's planning something. The pack can't afford to be caught off guard. Ronan felt his pulse quicken. Silas had been a threat from the moment he'd shown up, but hearing that he was building an army made Ronan's skin crawl. What should we do? You need to prepare, the Alpha said gravely. We don't know when or where he'll strike, but we need to be ready. I want you to increase patrols. No one is to be alone, especially not at night. If Silas is planning an attack, it's going to be brutal. We need all the strength we can get. Ronan nodded, his mind already racing with plans and strategies. I'll organize the pack. We'll be ready. The Alpha studied him for a long moment, his eyes sharp. And what about the Omega? What's going on with him? Ronan's heart stuttered. He hadn't expected that question, and for a brief moment, he hesitated. He's fine, he said, perhaps too quickly. He just needs some space. The Alpha raised an eyebrow, but didn't press the matter further. Make sure you take care of both the pack and the Omega. If Silas strikes, your bond to him might be the key to protecting everyone. Don't underestimate what you have. Ronan's chest tightened at the thought. The weight of responsibility was heavy, but the reminder of his bond with Eliot felt even heavier. As much as he wanted to help Eliot through his confusion, he also knew he couldn't afford to let his guard down, not with Silas looming in the shadows. As Ronan returned to camp, he found himself at a crossroads. On one hand, he had the pack's safety to consider, and on the other, he had Eliot, whose heart seemed to be slipping further from his reach. It wasn't easy to juggle the two, but Ronan knew he couldn't allow himself to choose between them. That evening, after another tense patrol, he found Eliot again. This time, he was standing near the edge of the camp, watching the moon rise, its pale light casting shadows over his form. Ronan's breath hitched as he approached, his footsteps quiet on the dirt. Eliot. Eliot didn't turn to face him, but Ronan could see the subtle tension in his posture. He had been standing there for hours, his figure outlined against the night sky. Ronan, Eliot said, his voice distant but not unkind. What's going on? I've heard rumors. Is Silas planning something? Ronan nodded, his throat tightening. Yeah. He's gathering a group of rogues. We're not sure when he'll strike, but the pack's on alert. Eliot's eyes flicked over to him, his golden gaze wary. And what does that mean for us? Ronan stepped closer, feeling the weight of the question. It means we need to stay strong. We need to protect the pack, and we need to be prepared for anything. Eliot didn't respond immediately, but Ronan could see the subtle shifts in his expression, hurt, confusion, uncertainty. It was the same look he'd seen in his eyes for days now, and Ronan knew he needed to do something to bridge the gap between them. I can't do this alone, Eliot, Ronan said softly, his voice steady despite the chaos in his chest. I need you. More than you know. The pack needs you. And I? He stopped, unsure how to finish the sentence. His feelings for Eliot were still tangled in his chest, too complex to explain in just a few words. Eliot finally turned to him, his eyes searching Ronan's face. I'm scared, Ronan, he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. I don't know what to do. I don't know where I fit in anymore. It feels like everything is falling apart. Ronan reached out, his hand brushing against Eliot's arm. He had no answers, no easy solutions, but he could offer his presence, his unwavering support. You fit in with me, Ronan said, his voice low and sincere. You always will. We're in this together, Eliot. And we'll face whatever comes next. I promise. For a moment, Eliot didn't speak. But then, he nodded, a small, fragile smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Together, huh? Ronan smiled in return, feeling a flicker of hope spark in his chest. They weren't there yet, not by a long shot, but they were making progress. And as the moon rose higher in the sky, Ronan knew that whatever Silas had planned, they would face it head-on, together. The night was quiet, but tension hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Ronan's thoughts remained clouded with the recent talk of Silas's growing threat. The rogue's power was undeniable, and it was clear that the pack was in danger. But more than that, Ronan's focus was still on Eliot, who seemed more distant with each passing day. As the wolves prepared for another night of increased patrols, Ronan found himself seeking out Eliot once more. He needed to know where they stood. Eliot, Ronan called as he spotted the smaller wolf near the edge of camp, his eyes distant as they looked out into the woods. Eliot didn't turn around, but his ears twitched at Ronan's voice. I'm listening, he replied quietly, though there was a slight tension in his tone. Ronan stepped closer, his heart heavy. You've been avoiding me. Why? I'm not avoiding you, Eliot said, his voice shaky. I don't know what we're doing anymore. Everything feels like it's falling apart. Ronan stood still for a moment, then slowly reached out, brushing a hand against Eliot's arm. We're facing this together. We'll figure it out, even if it's messy. But I can't do it without you. Eliot looked at him, his golden eyes softening just slightly. I don't know if I can believe that anymore. Ronan's chest tightened. You have to. Because I need you. The pack needs you. For a long moment, Eliot just stared at him, the silence thick between them. Finally, he sighed, the weight of his worries slipping from his shoulders. Fine. We'll take it one step at a time. Ronan nodded, relieved, though both knew there was more to their struggle than just these words. But for now, it was enough. Later that night, as the moon illuminated the clearing, Ronan couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was yet to come. Silas was closing in, but Eliot, his Omega, his equal, was the one he had to protect most of all. The threat from the rogue could be deadly, but a broken pack, torn by doubt and fear, was a far greater danger. And for the first time in days, Ronan felt a spark of hope, that maybe, just maybe, they could get through this together. The days were growing shorter, and the air had a bite to it. The pack's tension continued to mount as patrols were doubled and every wolf remained on high alert. Silas's rogue group was still a looming threat, but Ronan couldn't shake the feeling that the most dangerous challenge they faced wasn't external, it was the fractured bond between him and Eliot. As much as he tried to reassure the pack, he felt like a poor leader. He couldn't even protect the one wolf who mattered the most to him. Eliot. Ronan's voice broke the silence one evening as they both found themselves near the edge of the forest again. He had come to expect the quiet distance between them, but tonight felt different, darker. Eliot glanced at him, his eyes tired but searching. "What is it, Ronan?" Ronan took a step closer, his heart racing. "I know things haven't been easy between us. But I need you to know, I'm here. Not just as your alpha. But as... As who?" Eliot interrupted, his voice flat. "As someone I can rely on?" Ronan hesitated, the weight of the words heavy on his tongue. "I can't promise I'll always have the answers, Eliot, but I can promise that I'll always fight for you. Fight for us." The words felt clumsy, unsure, but they were the truth. He hadn't been prepared for the complexities of their bond, hadn't realized how deeply his feelings for Eliot ran until the distance between them had grown too great to ignore. Eliot didn't respond at first, his gaze distant as he stared into the trees. "I'm scared," he murmured. "I don't know where I fit in anymore. With everything going on, I don't even know if I'm supposed to be here." Ronan reached for his arm, his grip firm yet gentle. "You belong with me, with this pack. Don't doubt that." Eliot looked up, his golden eyes softening for the first time in days. "I want to believe that," he whispered. "But it's hard." "I know." Ronan's voice was raw, a reminder of how much was left unsaid between them. "But I'll show you. Every day, I'll show you." There was a long pause before Eliot nodded, though it was a hesitant movement. "All right. One step at a time." As they stood there in the gathering twilight, a heavy quiet settled between them. Ronan knew their path forward wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like they were walking it together. The night passed without incident, but the air was thick with anticipation. Ronan couldn't shake the feeling that Silas was getting closer, every passing day felt like the calm before a storm. His thoughts kept returning to Eliot and the quiet promise he had made, to fight for him, to fight for the pack. It wasn't much, but it was something. As he prepared for the next day's patrol, Ronan's resolve hardened. He wouldn't let anything tear them apart, not even the threat that loomed on the horizon. And maybe, just maybe, with time, he could heal the cracks in their bond. The pack was ready. Or at least, they had to be. Ronan had done everything in his power to prepare them for Silas's impending attack, and while their spirits were high, the air still buzzed with tension. The wolves moved with an alertness that spoke of the danger lurking just beyond their reach. Eliot, however, remained distant. His uncertainty about their bond still lingered like a shadow between them. Ronan couldn't help but notice the small ways Eliot withdrew, his gaze far away, his body language closed off. Ronan wanted to push him, to demand answers, but something told him that wasn't the way to fix things. "Alpha," Cade called as he approached, his expression serious. "There's been movement on the edge of the territory. A few rogues, nothing we can't handle for now, but it's definitely Silas's scent." Ronan's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the first sign that Silas was ready to make his move. "Gather the pack. We move at dusk." Cade nodded and rushed off, the urgency in his step matching Ronan's growing anxiety. Ronan took one last look around the camp, scanning the faces of the wolves. He spotted Eliot, standing apart as usual, his arms crossed, eyes on the ground. It was clear he was trying to stay out of the immediate conflict, but Ronan couldn't ignore the pull to him. Without thinking, Ronan walked toward him. "Eliot," he said softly, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. Eliot's eyes met his, a mix of confusion and something deeper, something vulnerable. "What is it?" Ronan hesitated for a moment, but then his words spilled out before he could stop them. I'm not letting you hide in the background anymore. You're part of this pack, Eliot. If Silas comes, I need you to be ready. Eliot's expression faltered, and he took a small step back. I don't want to be just some fighter, Ronan. I'm not like the others. I'm not. Don't, Ronan interrupted, stepping closer. His voice was firm, but there was a tenderness in his gaze. You're not just some fighter. You're my Omega, and you've always been more than just your role. You matter to me, Eliot. You're a part of this. No matter what. For a moment, Eliot said nothing, his golden eyes locking with Ronan's. The tension between them was palpable, but there was something else too, something that had always been there, unspoken. Finally, Eliot broke the silence. I'll fight, Ronan. But not because I have to. Because I want to. Ronan's heart swelled at the words. He reached out, brushing his fingers against Eliot's, the touch light but full of meaning. Good, Ronan whispered, his voice low but full of conviction. We fight together, then. Eliot nodded, his gaze softening for the first time in days. There was still fear in his eyes, but it wasn't the same as before. This time, there was resolve too. As the pack assembled, ready to face whatever threat Silas and his rogues had planned, Ronan couldn't help but feel a sense of unity among them. It was strange, this bond that had been so fractured just days ago was beginning to feel solid, almost unbreakable. And though the coming battle was uncertain, Ronan was sure of one thing: he would protect his pack, especially Eliot. No matter what it took. The night felt heavy with anticipation as Ronan led the pack toward the boundary of their territory. Every step taken was deliberate, and though the wolves moved in silence, the tension between them was undeniable. The scent of Silas's rogues had grown stronger, a sour, musky stench that made Ronan's hackles rise. Beside him, Eliot walked with a newfound steadiness, his posture more confident than it had been in days. The crackling tension from earlier had lessened, replaced by something else, something unspoken but understood. Stay close, Ronan murmured to Eliot, though his voice was barely above a whisper. And if anything happens? Eliot glanced at him, his golden eyes sharp and determined. I'll be right there with you. Don't worry about me. Ronan's chest tightened at the strength in Eliot's voice, but he didn't respond. The time for words was over. They needed to focus, to prepare for what lay ahead. As the wolves reached the tree line, Ronan signaled for them to halt. The forest around them was eerily still, the usual sounds of the night absent. Ronan's senses were on high alert, every muscle coiled in preparation for what was about to unfold. Alpha, Cade whispered urgently, his voice tight with concern. They are close. I can feel them. Ronan nodded grimly. We wait. Let them make the first move. It wasn't long before the first rogue emerged from the shadows, a dark shape, moving with a predatory grace. Ronan's eyes narrowed as more figures slowly revealed themselves, surrounding the pack in a silent show of dominance. Silas's voice cut through the tension, low and mocking. I see you've gathered your little pack. How quaint. Ronan's teeth bared in a flash of anger, but he didn't rise to the bait. This ends tonight, Silas. There was a moment of silence before the rogue leader laughed, the sound echoing through the trees. You think you can defeat me? You think he will protect you? Ronan's heart skipped a beat as Silas's eyes flicked to Eliot, who stood by his side, shoulders tense. Eliot's gaze never wavered, but Ronan saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes, something Silas had planted in his mind with a single, casual glance. Stay focused, Ronan muttered under his breath, his tone as sharp as a blade. We fight together. The rogues lunged first, their speed and viciousness almost too much to track. Ronan's instincts kicked in immediately as he shifted into his wolf form, muscles rippling with power as he leaped into the fray. A rogue came at him from the side, claws swiping at his throat, but Ronan dodged easily, sinking his fangs into the rogue's neck. Eliot! Ronan shouted over the chaos, his voice rising above the snarls and growls. Eliot was already in motion. The smaller wolf had always been agile, and tonight he fought like a force of nature, swift and unpredictable. Ronan caught a glimpse of him dodging a rogue's attack, his golden eyes flashing with determination. But there was a rogue who was too quick for Eliot. Ronan saw it just in time, a dark shape moving toward Eliot's blind spot, claws extended. "Eliot!" Ronan's voice was a desperate shout as he tore through the pack, barely avoiding a rogue snap at his side. Eliot was turning just as the rogue pounced, the predator's claws aimed directly at his throat. Before Ronan could reach them, Eliot's eyes flashed with recognition, and in a split second, he twisted out of the way, using his agility to avoid the worst of the strike. But the rogue's claws grazed his side, drawing blood. Ronan felt a jolt of panic in his chest as he watched Eliot stagger back, but the smaller wolf quickly regained his balance, teeth bared, ready to fight. "Get back!" Ronan growled as he charged forward, knocking the rogue away from Eliot with a brutal shove. The rogue yelped and scrambled back into the fight, but Ronan didn't waste time. His gaze locked with Eliot's. "Are you all right?" Ronan asked, his voice laced with concern, even as he fought off another rogue. Eliot nodded, though his breath came in ragged bursts. "I'm fine. Just a scratch." Ronan's heart pounded, but he couldn't afford to dwell on the fear. There was still a battle to be fought, and Silas was out there, watching, waiting. The fight raged on, but Ronan's focus remained on Eliot. He couldn't afford to lose him, not when they were finally starting to rebuild what had been broken. And as the last of the rogues fell, Ronan turned to find Eliot, panting and covered in scratches, but alive. Eliot's golden eyes met his, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Ronan saw something familiar, something like trust. "We did it," Eliot said, his voice rough but full of something stronger now. Ronan nodded, his breath heavy in his chest. Together. As they stood there amidst the fallen rogues, the pack gathered around them, and Ronan knew, with absolute certainty, that this bond, this fight, was just the beginning. The battle had ended as quickly as it had started, the remaining rogues retreating into the shadows of the forest. Ronan could feel his body pulsing with adrenaline, every nerve still on edge despite the quiet that had settled over the clearing. The pack gathered together, nursing their wounds, but there was a sense of victory in the air, a hard-earned one, but a victory nonetheless. Ronan's eyes scanned the area, his gaze landing on Eliot. His heart clenched when he saw the small, blooded scratch on Eliot's side, but it was nothing serious. The way Eliot stood, though, told a different story. He was shaking, though he tried to hide it behind a veneer of calm. His golden eyes were sharp, but there was a flicker of something else, something dark that Ronan couldn't quite place. Ronan stepped toward him, trying to mask his concern with a forced calm. "You did well," he said, his voice quieter than usual, almost gentle. Eliot didn't respond immediately, his gaze flicking away, lingering on the edge of the clearing where the rogues had disappeared. "I was just doing what I had to." "We all did." Ronan frowned, taking another step closer. "Eliot, that scratch." "I'm fine," Eliot cut him off, his tone a little sharper than necessary. "It's nothing." But Ronan could see the way Eliot's shoulders were tense, the way his movement seemed more rigid than usual. He wasn't fine, not really. The battle had shaken him more than he wanted to admit, and Ronan knew that it was more than just the physical injuries. "You're not fine," Ronan said softly, closing the distance between them. "You can talk to me, you know. About anything." Eliot met his gaze, his golden eyes filled with a mixture of frustration and something deeper. "I don't need you to fix everything, Ronan. I don't need you to keep checking on me. I can handle myself." Ronan's chest tightened at the coldness in Eliot's voice. It wasn't like the smaller wolf to shut him out like this, not after everything they had been through. It hurt more than he'd care to admit, but he couldn't push Eliot. "Not yet." "I'm not trying to fix you," Ronan said, his voice quiet but steady. "I'm just trying to be here. For you. We're a pack. We're supposed to lean on each other." There was a long silence before Eliot finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to lean on anyone anymore." Ronan's heart clenched at the raw vulnerability in his words, and before he could stop himself, he reached out, brushing his fingers lightly against Eliot's arm. "Eliot," he didn't know what to say. The weight of everything they'd been through, everything they were still dealing with, hung between them. But Eliot wasn't pulling away. Eliot looked at him, his golden eyes softening just a fraction. I don't know how to trust this, Ronan. How to trust you? Ronan felt his heart twist. He had always known that trust would be something they had to rebuild, but hearing it out loud, from Eliot, made the reality of it sink in deeper. I'm not going anywhere, Ronan said, his voice steady. I'm not going to force you, but I need you to know I'm here. Always. Eliot was silent for a moment, and for the briefest instant, Ronan saw something flicker in his eyes. A spark of hope, perhaps, or was it fear? I'm trying, Eliot said finally, his voice low. I just need time. Ronan nodded, understanding more than Eliot realized. Take all the time you need. But I'll be here. Whatever you decide. Eliot looked at him then, and for the first time in a long while, there was a crack in his defenses, a flicker of something real. Thanks, Ronan, he whispered, and Ronan felt it deep in his chest. The next few days were quieter. The pack was recovering, and the adrenaline from the battle slowly ebbed away. But there was an undeniable shift in the air, one that made everything feel different. As Ronan watched Eliot from across the camp, his heart swelled with a mixture of pride and worry. Eliot was stronger than he gave himself credit for, but there was still a wall between them, a barrier that neither of them had quite figured out how to tear down. But that was okay. Ronan knew that rebuilding trust would take time, just like it had with the pack. They would get there. Together. The days that followed the battle were quiet, but the peace felt fragile, like the calm before another storm. Ronan spent his time overseeing the recovery of the pack, making sure everyone was healing properly. He couldn't help but keep an eye on Eliot, though. Even from a distance, he could see the small, subtle changes in the other wolf. Eliot was quieter now, more withdrawn than before. He still fought, still protected the pack, but there was something in the way he carried himself that Ronan couldn't ignore. It was as if Eliot had closed a door in his heart, a door that Ronan wasn't sure how to open again. But Ronan wasn't giving up. He couldn't. Not when everything they had fought for, everything they were building, was at stake. One evening, after the last of the rogues had been dealt with and the pack had settled around the campfire, Ronan found Eliot sitting alone by the edge of the clearing. The firelight flickered over his golden fur, casting long shadows that made him look even more distant than usual. Ronan hesitated, then made his way toward him, every step deliberate. Eliot didn't look up as he approached, but Ronan could feel the tension radiating off him. Mind if I sit? Ronan asked, his voice quiet but steady. Eliot glanced up at him, his eyes unreadable. Sure. Ronan lowered himself beside him, careful to respect the small space between them. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and the crackling of the fire was the only sound that filled the silence. Finally, Eliot broke the quiet. You don't have to keep checking on me, you know. I'm fine. Ronan didn't respond right away. He wasn't sure what to say, but the words that came out of his mouth surprised him. I'm not checking on you, Eliot. I'm here for you. That's different. Eliot turned his head slightly, his eyes narrowing as if weighing his words carefully. I don't know how to do that, Ronan. How to just let someone be here. Ronan felt a pang in his chest. The vulnerability in Eliot's voice wasn't something he was used to hearing. I get it, he said softly. But you don't have to do it alone. Eliot's gaze dropped back to the fire, his shoulders slumping slightly. I've always done things on my own. It's easier that way. Ronan's heart ached at the words. He knew what Eliot meant. It wasn't just about the battle, it was about everything. The past. The things that had happened to him before he came here. We're stronger together, Ronan said quietly, his voice firm. You don't have to fight this alone. Eliot was silent for a long moment, the only sound the crackling fire. Then, finally, he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. I don't know if I can trust that, Ronan. Not yet. Ronan's heart sank, but he didn't pull away. He wasn't going to force anything. He'd given Eliot time, space, but this was different. Ronan could feel it, too. The gap between them had closed just a little, but not enough. Not yet. You don't have to trust me all at once, Ronan said, his voice gentle. But you can trust that I'm not going anywhere. I'll be here. For however long it takes. Eliot finally turned his head to look at him, and for a brief moment, their eyes locked. There was still uncertainty there, but there was something else, too. A glimmer of hope. Thanks, Eliot said softly, almost shyly. Ronan smiled, though his heart was still heavy with the weight of the uncertainty between them. But this small moment, was progress. It was a beginning. And that was enough for now. The next few days brought new challenges, but Ronan noticed a shift in the pack. Eliot had begun to interact more with the others, his previous withdrawal easing slightly. He still wasn't as open as he used to be, but the cracks in his walls were growing, even if it was only by inches. And Ronan? Ronan remained patient, waiting for the moment when they could finally bridge the gap between them. He wasn't in a hurry. He couldn't rush them. Later that evening, after the pack had settled for the night, Ronan found himself lying on his back, staring up at the stars. The night air was cool, and the sounds of the forest surrounded him, calming and steady. He could feel the weight of leadership settling on his shoulders, but it was a weight he was willing to bear. A rustling sound broke his thoughts, and he turned to find Eliot approaching, his silhouette framed by the moonlight. "You're not sleeping?" Ronan asked, his voice quiet. Eliot paused, then shook his head. "Too much on my mind." Ronan sat up, motioning for him to join him. "Want to talk about it?" Eliot hesitated for a moment before sitting down beside him. They didn't say anything for a while, just sitting in the quiet comfort of each other's presence. But it was different this time. There was no pressure, no expectation. Just two wolves, together. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," Eliot finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Ronan turned to him, his heart thumping in his chest. "And?" Eliot met his gaze, his golden eyes soft. I think I'm ready to try. To trust this? To trust you." Ronan's heart soared at the words, though he kept his expression steady. "I'm here. Whenever you're ready." Eliot smiled, a small, tentative thing, but it was enough. "I think I'm ready now." And in that moment, with the stars overhead and the world around them quiet, Ronan knew they had taken the first step towards something that was theirs. Something real. The next few weeks passed in a steady rhythm. The pack was healing, both physically and emotionally. The battle had been hard, but it had brought them closer together. The wounds, though painful, began to fade, both the ones on the outside and the ones buried deep inside. Ronan could feel the change in Eliot. There was still caution in his movements, a guardedness that hadn't completely disappeared, but the weight that had seemed to hang over him was slowly lifting. Eliot had started to open up more, not just to Ronan, but to the rest of the pack as well. It wasn't a lot, but it was enough. For now. One afternoon, as the pack trained in the clearing, Ronan noticed Eliot standing off to the side, watching the other wolves practice their combat moves. His posture was relaxed, but there was a tension in his expression that Ronan knew all too well. Without thinking, Ronan crossed the clearing, making his way toward him. Eliot didn't notice him at first, his focus fixed on the sparring wolves, but when Ronan stopped beside him, Eliot finally turned to face him, his eyes flicking to the ground. "You're still holding back," Ronan said, his voice calm but firm. "I can see it." Eliot sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know what you want from me, Ronan. I'm doing what I can." Ronan frowned, looking at Eliot closely. "I don't want anything from you, Eliot. I just want you to trust yourself. You're stronger than you think." Eliot's lips curled into a small, wry smile, but there was no humor in it. "It's hard to trust yourself when everyone else already does." Ronan's heart skipped a beat at the words. He had always known that Eliot carried some heavy burdens, but this was different. "You think they only trust you because of me?" Eliot's eyes flicked to him, a mixture of confusion and frustration in his gaze. "No. but I feel like I'm always a step behind everyone else. I've been trying to keep up, but I don't know if I'm cut out for this. Ronan took a deep breath, stepping closer. He could see the vulnerability in Eliot's eyes, the cracks in his confidence that no one had seen before. You're already more than enough, Eliot. Don't let your past tell you otherwise. Eliot didn't respond immediately, his gaze drifting back to the pack, but Ronan could see the way his shoulders had relaxed just a little. I'll try, Eliot said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Ronan smiled, his heart lighter than it had been in a long time. That's all I can ask for. The next few days were a turning point for Eliot. There was no dramatic change, no sudden transformation, but Ronan could see it in the way he carried himself. He wasn't as hesitant, as unsure. He wasn't just the Omega in the pack anymore. He was a wolf, a valuable part of their family, just like the others. One evening, as the pack sat around the campfire, Ronan found himself next to Eliot again. This time, there was no tension, no unspoken words between them. Just two wolves, sharing the quiet of the night. I've been thinking, Eliot said, his voice quiet but steady. Maybe I should start leading training tomorrow. With the younger pups. Ronan raised an eyebrow, surprised by the suggestion. You want to lead the training? Eliot nodded, his golden eyes meeting Ronan's with a newfound confidence. I've got a lot to prove, and I can't do that by sitting on the sidelines. Ronan smiled, pride swelling in his chest. You'll do great. Eliot's lips quirked into a smile, a real one this time. I know. For the first time in a long while, Ronan felt like they were both moving forward, not just as Alpha and Omega, but as equals. There was still a lot to figure out, a lot to work through, but this felt right. They weren't just two wolves in a pack anymore. They were two wolves who were learning to trust each other, to lean on each other, to fight side by side. And in that moment, Ronan knew that no matter what came next, they were ready. The days that followed marked a new chapter for the pack. Eliot began leading training sessions for the younger pups, his confidence growing with every lesson. At first, Ronan had kept a watchful eye, ensuring everything went smoothly, but soon he found that Eliot needed little guidance. The Omega was quick to step into his role, his natural instincts as a leader coming through more than Ronan expected. But as Eliot grew into his own, something else started to shift within the pack. The dynamic had changed. It wasn't just the Alpha at the forefront anymore, it was Eliot, too. And with that change, Ronan began to feel the weight of leadership pressing down on him more than ever. There were murmurs in the pack, quiet conversations behind closed doors. The wolves were starting to look at him differently, not with the same reverence they had before, but with curiosity, with questions. And some, he could feel, with a hint of doubt. Ronan knew this day would come eventually. As Alpha, he had to prove himself not just in battle, but in everything else. But it didn't make the pressure any less heavy. The pack wasn't just looking to him for strength, they were looking to him for guidance, for wisdom. They wanted him to lead them into a future, not just fight off the threats of the present. That evening, as the pack settled around the campfire, Ronan found himself alone with Eliot by the edge of the clearing. The night air was cool, and the sound of the forest was a soothing backdrop to the tension that was slowly building within him. You've been quiet lately, Eliot said, his voice casual but with a hint of concern. Ronan glanced at him, offering a small, tired smile. Just thinking. About the pack, about what's ahead. Eliot raised an eyebrow. You mean about how they're looking at you now? Ronan froze for a moment, surprised by Eliot's perceptiveness. He hadn't said anything to anyone, but somehow Eliot knew. Yeah, he admitted, his voice low. I can feel the eyes on me. They're waiting for me to prove myself. It's not just about strength anymore. It's about leadership. Eliot nodded, his golden eyes thoughtful. You don't have to do it all alone, Ronan. Ronan turned to look at him, his gaze steady. I know. But they need me to be strong. To make the right decisions. You've already done that, Eliot said, his voice unwavering. You're leading the pack, keeping us safe. But that doesn't mean you have to carry the weight alone. The pack is here for you, just like you're here for them. Ronan felt a wave of gratitude flood through him. Eliot's words hit deeper than he expected. He had always known that being an alpha wasn't just about the strength in battle, it was about trust, about knowing that your pack had your back. But hearing those words from Eliot, from the one wolf who had once been so unsure of him, meant everything. "I don't know what I'd do without you," Ronan admitted, his voice soft, sincere. Eliot turned to him, his expression almost shy. "You'll never have to find out. We've got each other's backs, remember?" Ronan smiled, the tension in his chest easing. Eliot had a way of making everything seem simpler, of reminding him that they were in this together. And for the first time in a while, Ronan felt the weight of leadership shift from his shoulders just a little. The following days were busy, with the pack working together to rebuild and strengthen their defenses. The training sessions had become more intense, and Eliot was beginning to take on a more active role in shaping the younger wolves into strong fighters. It wasn't just about physical strength anymore, it was about their unity, their ability to stand together against any threat. Ronan knew that the pack was growing, evolving. And he knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth. There would be more challenges, more tests of their strength and unity. But as long as he had Eliot by his side, he felt like they could face anything. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the camp, Ronan found himself walking beside Eliot once more. The quiet between them was comfortable now, the bond they had formed over the past weeks stronger than ever. "You've come a long way," Ronan said, his voice quiet but filled with pride. Eliot gave him a small, self-deprecating smile. "I'm just doing what I can." "No," Ronan said, stopping in his tracks, "you're doing more than that. You're leading. You're teaching. You're becoming the wolf you were always meant to be." Eliot's smile softened, his golden eyes reflecting the fading light of the evening. "Maybe. But I couldn't have done it without you." Ronan's heart skipped a beat. They had come so far, and in this quiet moment, it felt like everything was falling into place. They were no longer just Alpha and Omega. They were a team. A family. Ronan stepped closer to him, his heart racing. "We're in this together," he said, his voice steady but full of meaning. Eliot looked up at him, his golden eyes warm with something more than just friendship, something deeper. "Always." And in that moment, Ronan knew that whatever challenges the future held, they would face them side by side. The days were growing shorter as autumn's chill began to settle into the forest, but the warmth of the pack's unity kept the cold at bay. Yet, despite the new harmony, Ronan couldn't shake the unease that had been creeping into his thoughts. The pack was stronger now, but there were still whispers in the trees, unseen threats lurking just beyond the reach of their safety. Eliot had been thriving, becoming more confident with each passing day, but Ronan couldn't forget the past. The scars that ran deeper than any physical wound still haunted him, and he knew that sooner or later, the pack's peace would be tested. One evening, as they gathered around the fire, the air thick with the scent of pine and wood smoke, Ronan's senses suddenly went on high alert. Something was wrong. He scanned the clearing, his sharp eyes catching nothing amiss, but the hair on the back of his neck stood on end. His gaze flicked to Eliot, who was sitting quietly beside him, his expression relaxed. Ronan's instincts screamed at him to protect. But from what? Before he could voice his concerns, a low growl interrupted the night. It was deep, menacing, coming from the edge of the clearing. The pack stilled, every wolf tensing, their eyes darting to the source of the sound. Ronan's muscles coiled, ready to spring into action, his golden eyes narrowing. Eliot's hand brushed against his, a silent reassurance. "What is it?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the growing tension. Ronan didn't have to answer. The pack had already begun to move, shifting into formation, their senses heightened, waiting for his command. But Ronan wasn't about to give one until he knew exactly what they were facing. Suddenly, from the shadows, a lone wolf stepped into the clearing. Its fur was matted, its eyes bloodshot with anger. The moment Ronan saw the wolf, his heart sank. The last time he had seen this wolf, it had been in a different pack, rival, one that had caused them so much trouble in the past. "Ronan," the wolf snarled, its voice rough, as if it had been searching for him for a long time. "We need to talk." Ronan's jaw clenched, his body bristling with the urge to attack. But he held himself back. This was no simple skirmish, this was something more. Eliot stood beside him, his stance defensive. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice steady but laced with caution. The wolf's gaze flicked to Eliot, a smirk twisting its lips. "Ah, the Omega. Ronan's little pet." Ronan's vision darkened, a growl building in his throat, but Eliot placed a hand on his arm, stopping him from reacting. "Let him speak." The rogue wolf's eyes hardened. "I've come with a warning. There's a storm coming. You think your pack is safe now? Think again." It paused, its eyes glinting with malice. "Your pack is vulnerable, Ronan. And you." "Enough." Ronan snapped, his voice cold and sharp as ice. "If you've come to threaten us, you'll leave with nothing but your life." The rogue wolf sneered, stepping closer. "You'll regret turning me away. The past never forgets, Alpha." With those final words, the wolf turned, disappearing back into the shadows as quickly as it had appeared, leaving the pack tense and on edge. Ronan's mind was already racing, his thoughts swirling with unanswered questions. What did the rogue mean by "the past never forgets"? What kind of danger was coming for them? Eliot watched him closely, his golden eyes filled with concern. "Are we ready for this?" Ronan didn't answer right away. The weight of leadership pressed heavily on him, but Eliot's presence, his unwavering trust, reminded him that he wasn't alone in this. "We will be," Ronan said, his voice low but resolute. "The pack has faced worse, and we've come out stronger every time. We'll face whatever comes next together." Eliot nodded, his hand once again brushing against Ronan's. "Together," he agreed. The night passed in uneasy silence. Ronan had barely slept, his mind turning over the rogue's cryptic words. He had expected challenges, after all, being Alpha was never easy, but this felt different. There was something personal in that wolf's warning. Something that connected to the past Ronan had tried so hard to bury. In the morning, the pack was on edge. They gathered in their usual training area, the air tense as Ronan addressed them. "Listen up, everyone," he said, his voice commanding and steady. "There's a threat out there, and we need to be ready." Eliot stood at his side, watching the pack with a quiet determination. He had become a leader in his own right, his influence evident in the way the younger wolves looked to him for guidance. He had earned their respect, and that gave Ronan hope. "We've faced threats before," Ronan continued, his gaze sweeping over the gathered wolves. "But this one is different. We need to be prepared for anything." The pack nodded in agreement, their expression serious but determined. Ronan turned to Eliot, his gaze softening for just a moment. "We'll handle this, together." Eliot's lips quirked into a small, determined smile. "I trust you, Ronan. And I know we can do this." As the days passed, the pack doubled down on training. Every wolf was pushed to their limits, preparing for the unknown. But there was still something lingering in the air, a sense of impending danger that no one could shake. Ronan couldn't help but wonder, what exactly was the rogue warning them about? Was it just a ploy to get under his skin, or was there a deeper, more dangerous threat waiting for them on the horizon? Whatever it was, Ronan knew that he had to protect his pack, no matter the cost. The tension that had hung over the pack seemed to dissipate for a moment, but Ronan could feel the cracks in their peace. The rogue's cryptic warning still echoed in his mind, and his thoughts continued to race through possible threats. Yet, as the pack worked tirelessly to prepare for what was coming, Ronan couldn't help but notice something strange happening to Eliot. It was subtle at first. A slight change in Eliot's behavior, more frequent moments of exhaustion, a slight touch of nausea, and a general aura of being off balance. At first, Ronan thought it was just the stress of training and the looming danger, but something didn't sit right. "Eliot?" Ronan's voice was soft as he approached the Omega. They had become so close over the past few weeks, their bond growing deeper with each passing day. The comfort of their touch, the exchange of glances that spoke volumes, Ronan found himself increasingly lost in Eliot's presence. Eliot smiled up at him, but there was a tiredness in his eyes that wasn't there before. "Yeah?" He ran a hand through his golden fur, his expression briefly faltering before he masked it with a faint grin. "You don't look well," Ronan said, his voice filled with concern. "Are you sure you're all right?" Eliot hesitated for a moment, then glanced away, his hand resting on his stomach as if he were trying to hold something in. "I think I might be." He paused, his voice barely above a whisper, "pregnant." Ronan's heart skipped a beat. He had heard the rumors among wolves, the rare occurrences of Omega males becoming pregnant, a phenomenon that had always been mysterious and shrouded in secrecy. It was a gift, a blessing, but also a curse in many ways, especially for those who were not ready for it. "You sure?" Ronan asked, his voice tight with both concern and disbelief. The idea of Eliot carrying their child sent a rush of emotions through him, excitement, fear, and a deep sense of protectiveness. But there was also uncertainty. They had only just found each other. They hadn't even fully navigated their relationship yet, and now, this? Eliot nodded slowly, his eyes avoiding Ronan's gaze. "I'm pretty sure. I've been feeling strange," and he trailed off, his hand tightening over his stomach as though holding something precious inside. "I didn't know how to tell you." Ronan's heart ached at the uncertainty in Eliot's voice. He took a step closer, gently cupping Eliot's face with one hand, guiding him to look up at him. "You don't need to hide anything from me, Eliot. You're not alone in this. We'll figure it out together." Eliot's eyes softened, and for a brief moment Ronan saw the vulnerability there, something deeper than the confident, powerful Omega who had been standing beside him for weeks. Eliot was more than just his packmate now. He was his mate in every sense of the word. "I don't know what to do," Eliot whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "I wasn't expecting this. I don't think I'm ready for it." Ronan's thumb stroked Eliot's cheek tenderly, his gaze filled with a quiet, steady determination. "I don't know what's ahead either. But I do know one thing, we're in this together. You don't have to carry this burden alone. We'll face whatever comes, and we'll do it as a family." A tear slid down Eliot's cheek, and Ronan gently wiped it away with the pad of his thumb. "Thank you," Eliot whispered, his voice barely audible. Ronan's heart tightened, and before he knew it, he pulled Eliot into a tender kiss. Their lips met softly at first, the kiss filled with the shared weight of their unspoken fears and hopes. But as the kiss deepened, the connection between them ignited, a spark that neither of them could deny. As they pulled back, breathless, Eliot smiled softly, his face flushed from the intimacy. "You mean it?" he asked quietly, his hand resting on Ronan's chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath his palm. "Of course, I do," Ronan murmured, his lips brushing against Eliot's forehead. "We're in this together." The night stretched on, the world outside their intimate bubble continuing on, unaware of the quiet promise that had been made in the flickering moment. In the days that followed, the pack's training continued, but there was a new sense of closeness between Ronan and Eliot. The tension that had once weighed heavily on them now felt lighter, the bond between them growing stronger with each passing day. Ronan found himself more protective of Eliot, more aware of his every need and desire. Eliot, too, seemed to settle into the knowledge of what was happening to him, though the uncertainty remained. As the days went on, Ronan's support was constant, his care for Eliot growing with each passing moment. They spent their nights together, talking about their future, about the challenges they would face, and about the child they would bring into the world. And in the quiet moments, when their lips met in the shadows of their den, when their hands brushed against each other's, it was clear to both of them that their relationship was more than just about the bond of matehood, it was about the unspoken promise they had made to each other, to face whatever challenges came, side by side. As their story unfolded, Ronan knew that no matter the hurdles they would face, whether external threats from rogue wolves or the challenges of raising a family, they would always have each other. And with that certainty, the future no longer felt as uncertain as it once did. As the days passed, the bond between Ronan and Eliot grew stronger, marked by quiet moments of intimacy and support. The pack, ever watchful, had noticed the change in their relationship. There was a tenderness between the Alpha and Omega that hadn't been there before. Whispers spread through the pack, some with curiosity, others with concern, but Ronan paid them little attention. What mattered most now was Eliot, his mate, and the child they were about to bring into the world. One evening, as the full moon rose high above the tree line, Ronan and Eliot found themselves away from the pack, nestled in a secluded clearing. The air was crisp, the scent of pine and earth filling their senses, but there was an undeniable warmth between them. Eliot, whose pregnancy was now more apparent with each passing day, rested his back against a large oak tree, his eyes staring at the moon. "You're quiet tonight," Ronan observed, sitting beside him, his hand brushing against Eliot's. "What's on your mind?" Eliot sighed, his golden eyes tracing the pale light of the moon. "I've been thinking about the future, about the pack, about the baby. It's a lot, you know?" He laughed softly, a touch of nervousness in his voice. "I never imagined being here, pregnant, with an alpha like you. It's overwhelming." Ronan's gaze softened, and he leaned in, resting his forehead against Eliot's. "It's overwhelming for me too, but you're not alone in this. We'll figure it out together. You and me. The pack, too?" Eliot turned his head slightly, meeting Ronan's eyes. "And the baby?" Ronan smiled, a small, warm smile that made Eliot's heart flutter. "We'll raise them with love. They'll have a family, our family. One that's strong and full of promise. You're going to be an amazing father." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, the world seemed to pause. Eliot's heart swelled, the weight of the future suddenly feeling less daunting, and more like something he could handle with Ronan by his side. Their lips met softly, a quiet kiss that spoke of the trust they had in each other, the love they had cultivated, and the future they were ready to face together. As the kiss deepened, the connection between them became something more than just physical. It was spiritual, a recognition of their intertwined fates. Ronan's hand slid gently to Eliot's stomach, feeling the slight shift of the life growing inside him. It was a simple gesture, but it made Eliot's breath hitch, and a wave of tenderness washed over him. "I can't wait to meet them," Ronan murmured against Eliot's lips. Eliot smiled, a soft, knowing smile. "Me neither." The next morning, the pack gathered for the usual training session, but the mood was different. Eliot noticed the looks cast his way, the subtle glances and the quiet murmurs. The knowledge of his pregnancy had spread like wildfire, and the pack's reaction was mixed. Some wolves were supportive, offering words of encouragement and congratulations. Others, though, weren't as kind. Cade, still the pack's most outspoken beater, couldn't resist the urge to challenge Eliot, his sharp eyes scanning him as he walked past. "So, you're really going to have a pup, huh?" Cade's voice was low, laced with mockery. Eliot stiffened, but before he could respond, Ronan stepped in, placing a protective hand on his shoulder. "You've got a problem with it, Cade?" Cade smirked, his gaze flicking between the two. "No problem. Just wondering if an Omega like him is really ready for the responsibility." The tension was thick, the pack watching silently, waiting for Ronan to respond. But instead of anger, Ronan's expression was calm but firm. "I don't answer to you, Cade," Ronan said simply. "And neither does Eliot. If you've got an issue with the pack, take it up with me. Otherwise, keep your mouth shut." The words hung in the air, sharp and commanding. Cade's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered, nodding curtly before turning away. Eliot sighed, his shoulders relaxing now that the confrontation was over. "Thanks," he muttered, glancing up at Ronan. "I wasn't sure how I was going to handle that." Ronan's hand squeezed his shoulder reassuringly. "You don't have to handle anything alone. Not anymore." Despite the peacefulness of their moments together, the storm that Ronan had been anticipating was finally upon them. Late one night, the sounds of approaching wolves could be heard at the perimeter of the pack's territory. Ronan's ears pricked, his instincts on high alert as he and Eliot prepared for what was coming. Ronan turned to Eliot, his face grim. "Stay behind me," he ordered softly, but there was no mistaking the authority in his voice. Eliot nodded, his eyes narrowing. "I'm not some helpless Omega. I can fight too." Ronan gave him a reassuring smile. "I know. But right now, I need you safe. Our child needs you safe." Eliot's breath hitched at the mention of their child, but there was no time to dwell on it. The rogue pack had come, and they weren't going to just stand by and watch. The air was thick with the scent of danger as Ronan led the pack in defense, his muscles rippling with power. The rogue wolves circled, their eyes glinting with malice. Ronan's eyes met the leader of the rogue group, a large, scarred wolf that seemed to carry the weight of an old grudge. "This is our territory," Ronan growled, stepping forward. "Leave now, and there will be no bloodshed." The rogue alpha sneered, his lips curling back to reveal sharp teeth. "You're weak, Ronan. Your pack is divided, and it's only a matter of time before the Real Alpha rises." Ronan's stance didn't waver. "I am the Alpha here. And if you want to test that, you'll have to go through me." The battle that ensued was fierce, but Ronan's strength and determination were unmatched. Eliot, though anxious and eager to protect, stayed by the sidelines, watching his mate fight with the intensity of a true leader. And as the night wore on, Eliot found himself in awe of Ronan. Not just as an alpha, but as a protector. As a mate. The battle was over, but the tension in the air still lingered. The rogue pack, though fierce and determined, had been outmatched by Ronan's strength and the loyalty of his pack. The wounded were tended to, and the dead were taken care of with reverence as the pack mourned their losses. It was a victory, but it came at a cost. Eliot stayed by Ronan's side throughout the aftermath, offering his support and comfort as they assessed the damage. His heart still raced from the adrenaline of the fight, but there was something deeper stirring inside him now, a sense of protectiveness, not just for Ronan but for the future they were building together. As the last of the rogue wolves were driven off, Ronan turned to Eliot, his golden eyes filled with pride but also exhaustion. "You did well," he said, his voice rough from the battle. "I knew you had it in you." Eliot smiled, though his exhaustion mirrored Ronan's. "I couldn't let you do it alone," he said, his voice soft but firm. Ronan stepped closer, his hand finding Eliot's, squeezing it gently. "You never have to. We'll face everything together. No matter what comes next." Eliot's heart swelled at the sincerity in Ronan's words, but there was still something on his mind. "Are you sure we're ready for this? For everything? For the baby?" The words spilled out before he could stop them, but they had been weighing on him for days now. Ronan's expression softened, and he cupped Eliot's face, brushing his thumb across his cheek. "We're ready. We have each other, and we'll figure it out as we go. I'll always be here, no matter what." There was a moment of quiet between them, the weight of their shared promise hanging in the air. Eliot leaned into Ronan's touch, the sense of home that he felt whenever Ronan was near. And then, without another word, Ronan leaned down, pressing his lips against Eliot's in a slow, tender kiss. The kiss spoke volumes, of promises kept, of fears shared, and of the life they were about to build together. Days passed, and the pack began to recover from the skirmish. The moon hung high, casting a soft glow over the pack's territory, but there was a new sense of calm in the air. Ronan and Eliot had found their rhythm, moving through each day with a quiet confidence. They were a team now, partners in every sense of the word. One evening, as they sat together by the fire, Eliot rested his head against Ronan's shoulder, his eyes gazing into the flames. He could feel the baby growing inside him, its presence a constant reminder of the future that was unfolding. His body had changed in ways he hadn't expected, but it was a change he welcomed with open arms. "How do you feel?" Ronan's voice was low, soothing, as he ran a hand through Eliot's hair. Eliot's smile was soft but filled with love. "I feel connected. To you. To our baby. To this pack." He looked up at Ronan, his eyes filled with tenderness. "I'm not as scared as I was before. I know we can do this." Ronan's heart swelled at Eliot's words. He could feel the depth of their bond, the trust that had grown between them. This was what he had always wanted, a family. And not just a pack, but a family built on love, respect, and strength. "I'm glad," Ronan whispered, his lips brushing against Eliot's forehead. "You're not alone, Eliot. I'm here. Always." They sat in comfortable silence, the crackling of the fire the only sound breaking through the night. Eliot's hand rested on his stomach, a soft smile tugging at his lips as he imagined the future they would build together. A future where their child would grow up in a pack that loved them, protected them, and allowed them to flourish. The night stretched on, the world outside their little bubble of peace far away. But for Ronan and Eliot, there was no place they would rather be than right here, together. As the days turned into weeks, Eliot's pregnancy began to show more clearly. His body shifted, curves softening, a slight roundness forming as the baby grew. His moods, once erratic with the uncertainty of his situation, began to settle into a rhythm. The pack had slowly started to accept his role in this new chapter of their lives, with many offering words of encouragement and care. But it was the physical changes that were most apparent. Eliot began to feel the weight of his pregnancy more acutely now, the strain on his body both a reminder of the growing life inside him and a test of his strength. Though he had grown used to the occasional bout of nausea and tiredness, there were moments when the weight of it all felt overwhelming. One evening, as he and Ronan prepared for bed, Eliot found himself exhausted, the simple task of undressing feeling like an insurmountable challenge. For his tired body, he winced slightly as he pulled his shirt over his head, the weight of his growing belly making everything feel a little more difficult. Ronan, noticing immediately, was at his side in an instant. "Hey," Ronan said softly, his voice full of concern. "Let me help you." He gently took Eliot's hands, guiding him to sit on the edge of the bed before carefully unbuttoning his shirt for him. Eliot chuckled, though it was tinged with exhaustion. "I swear, I used to be able to do this by myself without needing assistance." Ronan smiled, brushing a strand of hair from Eliot's face. "It's not about assistance. It's about taking care of you. You're carrying our child, Eliot. That's no small feat." Eliot leaned into Ronan's touch, feeling the warmth of his presence wash over him. "I know. It just gets hard sometimes." Ronan nodded, his expression softening as he crouched down in front of Eliot. "I know. And I'm here for you. Whenever you need me. Don't carry the burden alone." Eliot's heart swelled with emotion as he looked at Ronan, the depth of his feelings for the alpha, his mate, growing stronger every day. Despite the challenges they had faced, despite the hardships, they had found something real, something powerful, and something that would carry them through whatever was to come. "Thank you," Eliot whispered, his voice barely audible. "I never imagined this life with you. But I wouldn't want it any other way." Ronan leaned in, brushing his lips against Eliot's in a tender kiss. "Neither would I. You and our child are everything to me." They stayed like that for a moment, wrapped in the quiet comfort of each other's presence, before Ronan helped Eliot settle into bed. As Eliot lay there, feeling Ronan's warmth next to him, the anxiety he had once felt about the future began to fade. With Ronan by his side, everything felt like it would be okay. The days were growing shorter as Eliot's pregnancy progressed, the final stretch arriving with both excitement and trepidation. The pack had started preparing for the new life that would soon be brought into their fold. Every wolf was pitching in, helping with tasks, gathering supplies, and ensuring that Eliot felt supported during this delicate time. But Eliot couldn't shake the nerves that had been gnawing at him. The closer he got to giving birth, the more he realized how much his world was about to change. And though he was no longer afraid of what lay ahead, the uncertainty still lingered. One evening, as the pack gathered around the fire for their usual meal, Eliot sat beside Ronan, trying to ignore the aching in his back as he adjusted his position. He had become used to the discomforts of pregnancy, but some days felt harder than others. "You're looking exhausted," Ronan said softly, his eyes scanning Eliot's face. "You should rest. I'll handle the pack business for the night." Eliot smiled weakly, grateful for Ronan's attentiveness. "I'm fine. Just a little tired." Ronan leaned in, pressing a kiss to Eliot's forehead. "You've been through a lot. Don't push yourself too hard." Eliot didn't argue, though he hated feeling so weak. But Ronan's quiet strength had become his anchor, and he allowed himself to lean into it, even if just for a moment. The fire crackled in the background as Eliot rested his head against Ronan's shoulder, feeling a strange peace in the stillness. Their baby shifted inside him, a gentle reminder of the new chapter they were about to begin. As the night wore on, the sounds of the pack's laughter and conversation faded into the background. Eliot felt Ronan's hand rest on his growing belly, his touch grounding. "I can't believe we're so close to meeting them," Eliot said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Ronan's gaze softened as he looked down at Eliot, his thumb brushing gently against Eliot's stomach. I've never been more ready for anything in my life. No matter what comes, we'll face it together. Eliot turned his face toward Ronan, meeting his gaze. I know. I've never felt more sure of anything either. Ronan smiled, a deep, sincere smile that made Eliot's heart flutter. We're ready, Eliot. Our family's almost here. The night arrived without warning, or perhaps with too much of it. The sharp pangs of labor sent waves of panic and excitement through Eliot's body. He breathed through the contractions, each one harder than the last, but he held on to the thought of Ronan, the alpha who had stood by his side through every moment. Ronan, ever vigilant, never left Eliot's side. He spoke in soothing tones, holding Eliot's hand, rubbing his back, his presence grounding Eliot in a world that seemed to spin out of control with each passing moment. Breathe, Eliot. I'm here, Ronan murmured, his voice full of strength and tenderness. We're doing this together. Just breathe. Eliot nodded, his chest heaving as he focused on Ronan's voice, trying to center himself amidst the pain. But nothing could quite prepare him for the intense wave of discomfort as the baby shifted, signaling that they were nearing the end of this journey. The pack had gathered around, but it was only Ronan's touch that calmed Eliot's nerves. He closed his eyes, trusting Ronan completely as his mate guided him through the most vulnerable moment of his life. With a final, excruciating push, everything changed. The world seemed to pause, and then the cries of their child filled the air. Eliot's heart soared as Ronan, eyes filled with pride and love, cradled their newborn. It's a boy, Ronan whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Eliot's breath caught in his throat, tears welling up as he gazed down at their son, small, fragile, and perfect. His heart swelled with an overwhelming love, and in that moment, everything else fell away. Hello, little one, Eliot whispered, his voice shaking with joy. You're finally here. The pack celebrated around them, their howls and cheers filling the air as Ronan held their son up, showing him to the world. Ronan turned to Eliot, his face illuminated by the firelight. We did it, Eliot. We have our family now. Tears filled Eliot's eyes as he reached for their baby, holding him close. The weight of everything, the challenges, the fears, the unknowns, melted away as he looked at their child, who had brought them closer than ever. Eliot leaned into Ronan, resting his head on his mate's shoulder as the world celebrated the birth of a new beginning. They had made it. Together.